So in one of my recent videos, I had somebody say to me, convince me I should buy the M6 Mark II over the Sony A6400. And while I'm not doing this channel to convince people to buy one camera or another, I do understand why he asked the question. And these were two cameras that I was really at pains to make the decision between one or the other. It was a very, very difficult decision. I just want to take you through my process, what I was thinking, and how I ended up with the M6 Mark II rather than the Sony A6400. And the first thing I want to talk about when we compare these two cameras are the photo capacity and the photo abilities in the M6 Mark II. And because YouTube is a video platform dominated by video creators, I don't think the photo capabilities of this camera get nearly enough coverage. And to start with, I have to talk about the 32 megapixel sensor. And I know 32 megapixels versus 24 megapixels, it's just a number. But actually, when I take the photos, these 32 megapixel photos, and I put them next to the 24 megapixel photos of my Canon M50, I can see that we are getting more usable resolution. Now, there's a caveat to that. You do need to use some quite sharp lenses, but the 32 megapixels does give you a significant increase in resolution. And not only are we getting those 32 megapixels, we are getting the Canon color science. We are getting those wonderful Canon colors. And while the Sony A6400 represents Sony coming a very long way in their color science in their cameras, it still isn't quite to the level that Canon's at. The gap has closed. Undoubtedly, Sony has closed that gap, but they have not surpassed or caught up to Canon in the color science and in the color category. Particularly when you look at representation of skin tones and colors in nature, the Canon cameras just have it over the Sony, and they have for years. And I can't talk about the Canon color science without talking about the picture profiles and picture style systems that you can use in the Canon cameras. Not only are there a handful of really good picture styles in the camera which allows you to tune the colors, much like you can do in the Sony, but in addition to that, you have the option of uploading 3 custom profiles. And Sony gives you free the tools to tweak those profiles or to import and add profiles that anyone else out there has created. And this has given us CineStyle and Marvel Cinema and all kinds of different picture styles that are great for both photo and video, and you just don't have that same capability and that same flexibility in the Sony. The next thing I need to talk about is the Canon menu system. The Canon menu system is really considered the gold standard when it comes to photo and video and usability for the average person. And this camera actually comes with an easy mode menu system, and once you sort of get used to all the features and functions, you can actually turn off that easy mode and enable the more advanced mode, which just makes the menu system look like any other Canon camera. But it really is the gold standard for ease of use and finding functions, and Sony, unfortunately, in this category is almost the gold standard of a terrible menu system. Even amongst Sony users, that Sony menu system is really almost universally disliked, and trying to find the function you want at different times can be very, very complicated, and so that usability with the menu system is miles behind what the Canon is. The other thing is the functionality of the touchscreen. The touchscreen on the Canon cameras is really second to none, and you can completely control the menu system, all the settings in the camera, completely from the touchscreen. Where the Sony's touchscreen really just gives you touch to focus, and other than that, you have to navigate the menus and do all the settings via the dials and buttons as you sort of move around and navigate the menus. So although it does have a touch screen, the functionality of the touchscreen is nowhere near what the Canon is. The next thing is the ergonomics of the camera. The way it feels in your hand, where the buttons and dials are. Not that the Sony is terrible, but really in this category, most people who put their hands on the EOS M6 Mark II have said that it is industry leading, it is class leading as far as the way it feels in the hand. The Canon ergonomics and handling really are second to none. And the next thing I'll talk about is the lens lineup. The EOS M system really gets a hard time about having a lack of lenses. I think there are only 7 native lenses produced by Canon. But the reality of it is, those native lenses are designed to be portable and give you something that fits with the size of the EOS M system. So you've got small portable lenses that aren't necessarily the fastest or the sharpest, although some of them are. There's no question that Canon has the best range of glass for its larger cameras, And you're talking about a $100 adapter from Canon or a $30 generic adapter that will allow you to adapt all that glass, and you get native performance. Unlike the Sony and some of the other cameras which have adapters, but they're really trying to make a lens that wasn't designed to work with that camera. So you don't get that same level of performance. So although there is a very small range of native glass for the EFM mount, there is a huge range of EF and EFS glass, which is really industry leading as far as your selection of glass. The next thing is high-speed photography. You get 14 frames per second in the EOS M6. This is absolutely industry leading. There is no other camera of this size that produces 14 frames per second. The Sony's still good at 11 frames per second, but 14 frames per second really is mind-blowing, and it's sort of in line with the 1DX, like Canon's $6,000 or $7,000 camera. So to get that sort of performance out of a tiny little camera is really quite incredible. If 14 frames per second isn't good enough, you get 30 frames per second in raw burst mode, which is kind of a funny, unusual shutterless mode. But really, you don't have that option in any other camera. Like 30 frames per second of photography is really unheard of, and it's amazing that they've included it in this tiny little camera. And the other thing they've got is focus bracketing. Focus bracketing is something that allows you to create a clear image when your depth of field wouldn't allow you to have a focus that had the foreground and the background clear and sharp. So focus bracketing takes a series of photos and then puts them all together to create a clear, sharp photo with everything that's in the foreground and everything that's in the background. It's not something new, it's not a revolutionary technique, but Canon has built it into the camera for this system. So having said all that, why would you buy the Sony A6400 over the M6 Mark II? And this is where we have to talk about the video features. Sony 4K video in the A6400 is literally industry leading for its sharpness and detail. The A6400 takes a 6K image and downscales it to 4K to produce the 4K video. The Canon M6 Mark II, although we don't know exactly what's going on, it is believed that Canon is taking a 3 or 3.2K image and upscaling it to 4K. The next thing we have to talk about is the 120 frames per second video. Canon has unfortunately handicapped the M6 Mark II with 120 frames per second, but no autofocus. Where the Sony A6400 has 120 frames per second and it has full tracking autofocus. Now it's not all bad news for the video performance on the M6 Mark II. You still get those Canon color science, those great out-of-camera colors. You also get digital image stabilization, which allows you to use non-image stabilized lenses for video, which is something you don't get in the Sony. And you get a best-in-class performance when it comes to rolling shutter. And the Sony has actually got some of the worst performance in rolling shutter. But when it comes to video detail, this is where we start to play to the Sony's strength. When it comes to the video quality coming out of the Sony A6400, the M6 Mark II on a lot of levels just can't compete. Yes, it's an easier to use camera. It's very easy to get high quality photos and video out of. But if you're mainly focused on video, if you don't do any photography at all, and if you're willing to wade through the complicated menu system of the Sony, give up a little bit of color science and be able to tune the Sony in the way you want it, there's no question that you're going to get better 4K footage and you're going to get better 120 frames per second slow motion footage. And for me, that's what made it such a hard decision. In so many ways, the Canon technology is miles ahead of what the Sony is. It's got a newer sensor, it's got more functions, but when it comes to video, it just isn't quite as good. So as a video guy, why did I still buy the Canon M6 Mark II? And it really came down to three things. It was the Canon color science, it was the ergonomics and usability of the camera, and it was the selection of native EF and EFS glass, in addition to the EFM glass, that made me choose this camera. And in doing so, I accepted that I was giving up some detail in 4K and the autofocus in the 120 frames per second. So in the end, that was a compromise I was willing to make. You might not make the same decision, but if you do, and if you do buy the Canon M6 Mark II, Be sure to stay tuned to the channel because I'm currently doing a series of 100 videos on this camera and the lenses that go with it. So stay tuned for all my tips and tricks on how to get the most out of this camera system.